In the heart of a desperate battle, with German panzers tearing through the American lines, an entire tank battalion faced annihilation. Their machines, the mighty Shermans, were grinding to a halt, becoming helpless steel coffins in the deep Tunisian sand. But one small group of tanks, those bearing a secret, unapproved modification, sliced through the desert like ghosts, flanking the enemy and turning the tide in a single, decisive charge. This was the moment one sergeant's defiance was vindicated, the moment his forbidden invention saved them all. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The sun over Tunisia was a merciless hammer, beating down on the rows of M4 Sherman tanks until the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. In the motor pool, the atmosphere was a gritty cocktail of diesel fumes, the smell of hot metal, and the fine, pervasive sand that worked its way into everything. It was a war not just against a human enemy, but against the very ground they fought on. Lying on his back under the heavy steel belly of a Sherman, Sergeant Tommy Laird felt this truth in his bones. The compacted cakes of sand and grit he pulled from the bogie wheels were as dense and abrasive as grinding paste. He worked with a focused, almost reverent energy, his strong, calloused hands moving with a mechanic's certainty. He saw these machines not as simple hardware, but as living things, each with its own pains and quirks, and this one was an agony. He slid out from under the suspension, his fatigues dark with grease and sweat, and called over a fresh-faced recruit. "Evans, get over here. Take a look at this." Private Evans, barely out of his teens and still overwhelmed by the scale of it all, hurried over. Tommy held up a thick track pin in his palm, its surface gleaming under the oppressive sun. "See this, Evans?" he said, his voice low and intense. He pointed to a section of the pin that was visibly worn, ground down at an unnatural angle. "This isn't just dirt. This is the desert itself, trying to eat us alive. It gets in everywhere, between the pins, in the bushings, and it grinds and it grinds. It's like 1,000 tiny little files working away at the heart of this machine." The weight of the pin in his hand felt like a heavy metallic omen, a prophecy of mechanical failure. Evans squinted, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. "I just thought it was sand, Sarge." "It is," Tommy confirmed, his gaze drifting across the line of weary tanks. "But out here, sand is the enemy just as much as the Germans are. We're losing tanks not to their 88s, but to the very ground we're driving on. The engines are strong, but they're fighting the tracks every inch of the way." A deep, simmering frustration brewed in his chest. He treated every mechanical failure as a personal one, a puzzle he was meant to solve. He saw the bigger picture, a tactical reality that the officers, with their maps and manuals and pristine uniforms, seemed to be missing entirely. The grating sound of metal on sand was everywhere, a constant abrasive whisper that spoke of slow, inevitable destruction. Armed with the worn track pin and a piece of cardboard bearing a detailed sketch, Tommy stood before Lieutenant Davies's field desk. The lieutenant's office was a stuffy makeshift tent, where stacks of paperwork seemed to be losing a slow battle against the encroaching desert. Sand dusted every surface, a fine powder that symbolized the futility of imposing order on this chaotic landscape. Lieutenant Davies was a man who lived by the book, a creature of regulation and protocol. He wasn't a bad officer, just deeply unimaginative, his fear of deviating from the chain of command far greater than his fear of the enemy. He saw the war as a series of regulations to be followed, a complex but ultimately predictable equation. Tommy placed the worn pin on a stack of reports, the small piece of metal, a stark, physical testament to the problem. He held up his diagram of the Sherman suspension, pointing to the areas where the sand accumulated, creating a choke point of friction. He explained his theory clearly and concisely, his words stripped of emotion, focusing only on the mechanical facts. The friction from the sand was causing the engines to overwork, to fight against their own treads. It was cutting their effective operational range by nearly half, and, more critically, causing catastrophic track failures at the worst possible moments. "Sir, we're burning twice the fuel to go half the distance," Tommy said, his voice earnest. "If a crew gets stranded out there because their track seizes, they're a sitting duck for every Panzer and anti-tank gun in North Africa. We need to find a way to shield the bogies, to keep the worst of the grit out." Lieutenant Davies leaned back in his creaking chair, steepling his fingers. He regarded Tommy with an air of weary patience. the look of a man forced to entertain a child's fanciful notion. "Sergeant, I appreciate your diligence," he began, his tone condescendingly placid. "But your job is to fix what's broken, not to redesign multi-ton war machines. We have engineers at high command, brilliant men with degrees, who worry about these things. They test these tanks in all conditions before they are ever deployed." Tommy felt a surge of frustration but held it in check. He had to make him understand. "With all due respect, sir, have those engineers ever been to Tunisia? Have they seen this sand? It's finer than anything they could have tested for. It's like flour. By the time a report makes it up the chain of command and a solution makes it back down, we'll be fighting on foot." The lieutenant's expression hardened, his patience evaporating. The challenge to the infallibility of the system was a challenge to his entire worldview. "That's enough, Sergeant," he said, his voice sharp and final. "Your concern is noted. Now, you will stick to the maintenance schedule. You will repair what is broken according to the manual, and you will not waste any more time on this. That's an order." The words hung in the hot, dusty air of the tent, a wall between them. The primary conflict was no longer just man versus desert, but man versus bureaucracy. Tommy was officially shut down, his practical life-saving knowledge dismissed as an inconvenience. He was isolated with his discovery, forced into a corner where the only choices were obedience or defiance. He picked up the worn track pin, its uselessness now a symbol of his own, and walked out of the tent, the lieutenant's order echoing in his ears. Dejected and angry, Tommy walked through the scrap pile behind the motor pool. It was the golden hour, and the setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows, turning the discarded metal into a graveyard of abstract sculptures. He kicked at a discarded ration can, the small, tinny sound lost in the vastness of the desert. He replayed the conversation with Davies in his head, the lieutenant's smug, dismissive tones stoking the fires of his indignation. His eyes scanned the junk, a chaotic collection of the war's refuse, bent engine cowlings, the twisted remains of a Jeep's chassis, spent shell casings gleaming like brass teeth. Then something caught the light. It was a stack of empty 55-gallon fuel drums, their sides dented and stained, but made of a thin, durable steel. He had walked past them 100 times without a second thought. But today, he stopped. He stared at one of the drums, his mechanic's eye tracing its distinct uniform curve. He picked up a jagged piece of sheet metal from the ground and held it against the drum's side, observing how the curve would naturally deflect anything that hit it, shunting it away. His mind, which had been a storm of anger and frustration, suddenly went quiet. An idea, a spark of pure, unadulterated inspiration, cut through the noise. He could see it perfectly in his mind's eye. He visualized cutting a section from the drum, using its inherent curve to create a simple, convex guard. He could weld it directly onto the suspension frame, just over the vulnerable bogie wheels. It would be a shield, a crude but effective barrier against the relentless assault of the sand. The sand would hit the curved surface and slide right off, never getting the chance to work its way into the delicate, vital machinery of the tracks. The anger at Davies faded, replaced by the electric jolt of a solution. He could see the process, feel the tools in his hands, the hiss and glare of the cutting torch, the solid, rhythmic clang of a hammer shaping the hot edge, the bright, molten flash of the weld fixing it in place. It was simple. It was crude. It was born from scrap. But it could work. He stood there for a long moment, the piece of jagged metal still in his hand, and weighed the consequences. This would be a direct violation of a clear order. It was an unauthorized modification of military equipment, a crime that could easily lead to a court-martial, disgrace, and a cell in the stockade. The fear was real, a cold knot in his stomach. Then, another image pushed its way into his mind, the face of a young tanker he had pulled from a disabled Sherman the week before. The boy's eyes had been wide with a primal terror, trapped in a steel box that had become a coffin, waiting for the inevitable German shell. The fear of punishment was eclipsed by the moral imperative to act. It was no longer a choice. It was a duty. He looked at the fuel drum again, but he no longer saw a piece of trash. He saw the key to survival. He saw the answer that the brilliant men with their degrees had missed. He saw a way to fight back not just against the panzers, but against the desert itself. The sun dipped below the horizon, and in the gathering twilight, Sergeant Tommy Laird made a decision. He was going to break the rules to save his men. The desert night offered no relief, only a different kind of oppression. The heat of the day bled slowly from the sand, but the air remained thick and still. Long after midnight, in a secluded corner of the motor pool, shielded by a canvas-draped supply truck, a fierce, sputtering glare tore a hole in the darkness. It was the light of a welding torch, and against its brilliant blue-white pulse, Sergeant Tommy Laird was a silhouette of focused intensity. Sweat glistened on his face and arms, tracing paths through the grime as he carefully cut a long, curved section from a 55-gallon fuel drum. The air was thick with the metallic smell of ozone and the acrid scent of burnt paint, a strange incense for his secret workshop. Private Evans, acting as a nervous lookout, paced back and forth, his boyish face etched with anxiety. Every distant sound, every metallic clang from the camp made him jump. He was a good kid, loyal, but he wasn't built for this kind of clandestine defiance. His world was one of following orders, of clear rights and wrongs, and the line they were crossing was as bright and dangerous as the sparks showering from Tommy's torch. "Sarge, I heard boots," Evans whispered, his voice tight with panic. He peered around the corner of the truck, his knuckles white where he gripped his rifle. "I swear, I think someone's coming." Tommy didn't look up. His concentration was absolute, his hand steady as he guided the flame along the chalk line he'd drawn. "It's just the sentry on his rounds," he said, his voice calm and low, a rock in Evans's sea of nerves. "He won't come back here. It's the last place he checks. Now, hold this steady for me." He finished the cut and, using heavy tongs, lifted the glowing piece of metal, placing it on a makeshift anvil, a solid block of steel scavenged from a wrecked half-track. The rhythmic, solid clang of his hammer, shaping the hot steel, began to echo softly in their hidden corner, a sound of creation amidst the vast, destructive enterprise of war. Each blow was precise, economical, the work of a craftsman who understood his medium. He wasn't just bending metal, he was forging a shield, a hope. After cooling the piece in a bucket of murky water, he held it up for Evans to see. It was simple, almost elegant in its crude functionality, a perfectly curved guard. "See?" Tommy said, his voice filled with a quiet pride that transcended the risk. "The sand hits this, and it just slides right off. It never even gets a chance to work its way into the bogies. It's a ramp, not a wall." Evans reached out and touched the cool, smooth steel. The tension in his shoulders eased for a moment, replaced by a flicker of awe. He could see it now, not as a piece of scrap, but as the solution Tommy had described. Still, the fear lingered. "But Sarge, if Lieutenant Davies finds out—" "He won't," Tommy said, his gaze already on the next fuel drum. "Not until it's too late for him to stop us." The tension of being discovered was a constant presence, a third man in their secret workshop. But for Tommy, it was fuel. The clang of the hammer was his argument, the hiss of the torch his defiance. He was no longer just a mechanic fixing what was broken. He was an inventor. And in the heart of the Tunisian desert, under the indifferent stars, he was starting a quiet, desperate revolution, one piece of welded steel at a time. In the gray pre-dawn light, the air was cool and still, the desert holding its breath before the sun's assault. On a deserted track behind the main camp, the tank known as Desert Rose sat waiting. It was a Sherman like any other, except for the crude, unpainted additions to its suspension. The first set of Tommy's guards were bolted and welded in place, their dark curved forms a stark violation of military uniformity. They looked out of place, like barnacles on a warship, a physical manifestation of Tommy's insubordination. Evans stood beside the tank, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his eyes scanning the horizon not for the enemy, but for his own officers. Tommy's expression was a tight mask of hope and anxiety as he climbed into the driver's hatch. This was the moment of truth, his theory, his clandestine work, the risk he had forced upon Evans. It all came down to this. He took a deep breath and started the engine. The roar shattered the morning quiet, a familiar guttural sound that was both comforting and nerve-wracking. He didn't stay on the packed earth road. Instead, he deliberately veered the 30-ton machine into a deep, treacherous patch of loose, powdery sand, the kind that had been crippling the battalion for weeks. The tank lurched as it hit the soft ground, the engine groaning in protest. Tommy pushed it hard, churning the sand up into a massive, suffocating cloud that enveloped the Sherman. He made several sharp, grinding turns. forcing the tracks to work at their most vulnerable angles, deliberately inviting the very failure he was trying to prevent. From the outside, it looked like a driver courting disaster. To Tommy, it was the only real test that mattered. After several long minutes that felt like an eternity, he brought the tank back to their starting point and cut the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. Before the dust had even settled, both men dropped to the ground, their faces close to the tracks. Tommy ran his hand along the bogie wheels, his fingers probing the complex machinery of the suspension. He held his breath. Evans, seeing the look on his sergeant's face, did the same, peering into the shadows under the hull. The silence stretched, thick with anticipation. Then, Evans let out a low whistle. "Sarge, look," he said, his voice filled with a profound, disbelieving awe. "They're clean. I mean, almost perfectly clean." Tommy saw it too. Where there should have been thick, compacted cakes of sand grinding away at the pins and bushings, there was only a light dusting. The guards had worked. They had deflected the deluge of sand, shielding the vulnerable heart of the tracks. It wasn't just a theory anymore. It was a proven fact, demonstrated in the very sand that was their enemy. A wave of triumphant relief washed over Tommy, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He leaned his forehead against the cool steel of the hull and closed his eyes, a silent prayer of thanks on his lips. For a fleeting moment, they were not a sergeant and a private, but two co-conspirators, two inventors sharing a secret victory against impossible odds. The feeling was intoxicating, but it was immediately followed by a chilling realization. Their secret was no longer just an idea or a project hidden in the dark. It was now a physical, visible modification on a piece of United States Army hardware. Discovery was no longer a risk. It was an inevitability. The hammer fell mid-morning. The sun was high and hot, and the motor pool was a hive of activity, the air buzzing with the sounds of maintenance and the nervous energy that always accompanied a visit from the top brass. Major Croft was a senior officer on an inspection tour, a man who seemed to have been carved from granite. He was large and imposing, with a jaw that looked like it could chew through steel and eyes that missed nothing. He embodied the unbending, impersonal authority of the military, a force of nature in a starched uniform. Lieutenant Davies followed him like a nervous shadow, his face slick with sweat, laughing a little too loudly at the major's infrequent, humorless jokes. Croft walked down the line of Shermans, his gaze sweeping over each vehicle with an unnerving intensity. He stopped dead in front of the Desert Rose. He stared at the welded-on guards, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to a cold, simmering fury. The silence that fell around him was absolute. Even the distant clang of a hammer stopped. "Lieutenant," Major Croft said, his voice dangerously quiet, a low rumble that promised a storm. "What is this? Unauthorized garbage welded onto my tank?" Lieutenant Davies went pale, his eyes wide with terror. He looked at the guards as if seeing them for the first time, his mind scrambling for an explanation, a denial, a scapegoat. "Sir, I was not aware." His frantic gaze landed on Tommy, who was working on a nearby Jeep engine, his back to them. "Sergeant Laird!" Davies bellowed, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and fury. "Front and center!" Tommy's heart sank. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and walked over, his movements deliberate. He snapped to attention before the major, his eyes fixed on a point just over the officer's shoulder. He knew this was it. "Did you do this, Sergeant?" Major Croft asked, his quiet voice more intimidating than any shout. Tommy's own voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil in his gut. "Yes, sir." "On whose authority?" "My own, sir," Tommy replied, meeting the major's icy glare. "It's a field modification to prevent track seizure from sand ingress." The major's face contorted, and the quiet menace exploded into open rage. "You are a mechanic, Sergeant, not a one-man research and development division," he roared, his voice echoing across the now silent motor pool. "You have willfully ignored regulations, you have defaced government property, and you have endangered the crew of this vehicle with an untested, unapproved modification. I want this scrap metal cut off this tank immediately, and you will consider yourself on report, Sergeant. This kind of rogue foolishness, this blatant disregard for the chain of command, is how men die." The words struck Tommy with physical force. He stood ramrod straight, his face a stony mask, as the major dressed him down in front of his peers. The institutional resistance he had feared had materialized in its most intimidating form. He was facing a formal court-martial, the destruction of his project, and the end of his career. Major Croft, his face still flushed with anger, turned on his heel and stormed away, leaving Lieutenant Davies to stammer out orders for the guards to be removed. Tommy was left standing alone in the oppressive heat, the weight of his failure heavier than any tank. Later that day, the bustling, noisy mess tent felt like a world away from the motor pool. The air smelled of beef stew and stale coffee, the familiar background noise of hundreds of men eating and talking a dull roar. Tommy sat alone at a long wooden table, pushing a lump of mystery meat around his metal tray with a fork he had no intention of using. The Major's words echoed in his head. Rogue foolishness is how men die. The public humiliation was a fresh wound, but the order to destroy his work was what truly gutted him. He had failed. The bench opposite him scraped against the floorboards as a large figure sat down. Tommy looked up to see the grizzled, weather-beaten face of Sergeant Bill Corrigan, a man the enlisted crews affectionately called Pops. Pops was a tanker from the last war, a veteran commander who had forgotten more about armored combat than Lieutenant Davies would ever know. He was the one who commanded the Desert Rose, and he had a calm, authoritative presence that came from years of experience, not from the rank on his sleeve. Pops placed his tray on the table and looked at Tommy, his expression unreadable. The younger mechanics and crewmen at nearby tables watched with cautious interest, sensing a significant moment was unfolding. Heard Major Croft redecorated the motor pool with your hide this morning, Pops said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Tommy just nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He felt a fresh wave of shame, imagining what these combat veterans must think of him, the grease monkey who got caught playing engineer. Pops leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, and lowered his voice. I also heard my tank ran for 5 hours this morning on patrol, and didn't once sound like she was gargling rocks, he said, his eyes locking onto Tommy's. The boys in my crew, they're calling your invention sand scrapers. They said the Rose moved through the soft patches like a gator through a swamp. They work, Laird. He paused, letting the words sink in. I don't give a damn what the brass says in their clean tents. I care about what keeps my crew alive. Tommy looked up, startled. He had expected scorn, or at best, pity. He had not expected this. Pops continued, his voice firm. Don't stop. You find a way to keep making them. My crew, and a few others I've talked to, will cover for you. We'll say we're doing late-night maintenance, swapping out a generator, anything to get you the time and the space. You bring us your parts when they're ready, and we'll get them on the tanks ourselves if we have to. He looked Tommy directly in the eye, a silent pact passing between them. The men who actually fight in these things, son, we know what we need, and we need this. The despair that had settled in Tommy's chest began to recede, replaced by a fragile, growing hope. He was no longer alone. He had found a crucial ally, not in an officer with authority, but in the men whose lives depended on his invention. This wasn't just about a mechanical fix anymore. It was the beginning of a quiet, underground rebellion. It was a rebellion of the enlisted men, a conspiracy of grease-stained mechanics and battle-hardened tankers who trusted practical results over rigid protocol. It was a rebellion against a command structure that couldn't see the sand for the desert, and Tommy Laird was now its reluctant, unlikely leader. Weeks bled into one another, each day a copy of the last, hot and gritty. The clandestine operation in the motor pool took on a life of its own, a silent nocturnal rhythm running counter to the Army's daily grind. By night, under the dim, shielded lights of their secret workshop, Tommy and a few loyal mechanics, their faces grim with determination, fabricated the curved steel guards. By day, the conspiracy spread to the tank crews themselves. A driver would report a phantom engine knock. A commander would insist on a spurious track inspection, anything to create a window of opportunity, a plausible excuse for their Sherman to be in Tommy's corner of the motor pool. The camp became visually divided, a physical ledger of Tommy's defiance. Half the Shermans now sported the dark, functional guards, a subtle but clear deviation from standard issue. The other half remained unmodified, their crews looking on with a mixture of skepticism, envy, and a dawning anxiety. Tommy had a quiet conversation with Pops Corrigan while they both inspected the now famous Desert Rose, its guards bearing the first small dings and scratches of operational use. The boys in Charlie Company are getting jealous, Pops said, running a hand over the smooth, welded steel. "They're calling their own tanks sand traps. How many we got done, son?" Tommy wiped a smear of grease from his brow with the back of his hand, his eyes scanning the rows of tanks. "Just over half the battalion," he answered, his voice low. "We're running out of good scrap, and luck. I heard Major Croft is due back from headquarters any day now." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. They were in a race against time, against the inevitable return of the man who had promised to court-martial him. Tommy felt the immense weight of his gamble. He hadn't been sleeping well, his dreams filled with the sounds of grinding gears and the high, tearing screech of breaking steel. He would look at the two types of tanks, the modified and the unmodified, and see a stark tally of his insubordination. A constant gnawing anxiety chewed at him, the fear that he might have been wrong, that his simple fix might fail under the unimaginable stress of real combat, costing men their lives and proving the major right. The shared secret among the enlisted men was a fragile bond, a web of knowing glances and hushed conversations in the mess tent. The air was thick with the unspoken question that haunted Tommy's every waking moment. Will the gamble pay off? The answer came on a Tuesday. The attack was as sudden and violent as a flash flood in a dry wadi. One moment, the American battalion was on a routine patrol, spread out in a wide, confident formation across a vast, empty expanse of the Tunisian desert. The next, the northern horizon, which had been a shimmering line of heat haze, resolved into a dark, menacing shape. A line of German panzers, including several long-barreled Panzer C4s, crested a distant dune ridge, their silhouettes stark against the pale blue sky. They had achieved complete and devastating surprise. The first shells screamed overhead, their demonic whistle ending in a series of deafening explosions that threw geysers of sand and steel into the air. The radio in every tank crackled to life, the calm but urgent voice of Major Croft cutting through the rising panic. "All units, this is Overlord. We are engaged. Execute maneuver Delta 79er. Repeat, Delta 79er. Flank left and engage from the west." Tommy, riding in the co-driver's seat of the Desert Rose, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. Delta 79er was a demanding high-speed flanking maneuver, a wide sweep through a long valley known to the tankers for its deep, soft, treacherous sand. It was a race against time, a desperate bid to get at the Panzer's thinner side armor before they could chew through the American center. As the battalion pivoted to execute the order, the critical flaw Tommy had identified became brutally, catastrophically apparent. The unmodified Shermans, their engines pushed to the absolute limit, began to struggle almost immediately. Their tracks, inundated with the fine, abrasive sand, began to bind, to tighten, to seize. The radio, which had been a channel of command, became a chorus of desperation. "Cobra 3 is stuck! I've thrown a track! We're dead in the water!" A frantic voice yelled over the static. Another followed a second later. "This is Viper 1. We're immobilized. The engine is redlining, but we're not moving. We're sitting ducks out here." One by one, the unmodified tanks, nearly half the battalion's strength, faltered and ground to a halt. Their engines roared in protest, their treads refusing to move, turning them from weapons of war into stationary steel coffins, helpless targets for the methodical, advancing panzers. The desert floor became a scene of chaos and carnage. Explosions rocked the valley, and thick plumes of black smoke scarred the sky, marking the graves of American tanks. Inside the Desert Rose, Tommy gripped the pinal mount of his machine gun, his knuckles white, his eyes scanning the battlefield for targets for pops. The air was thick with the acrid smell of cordite and the deafening roar of their own engine, but it was a healthy roar, a powerful and unbroken sound. While half the battalion floundered and died, the tanks bearing Tommy's guards were performing magnificently. They cut through the soft sand with an agility that seemed impossible, their tracks shedding the grit as designed, their engines running smoothly. Pops's company, every tank modified, led the charge. They were a spearhead of defiance, a testament to a mechanic's stubborn ingenuity. "All Rose units form on me," Pops's calm voice cut through the chaos on his company's radio channel. "We're on their 6. Target the rear armor where it's thinnest. Pick your shots. Go, go, go." They successfully swept around the German formation, which was still focused on the easy stationary targets trapped in the valley. They emerged from the swirling dust and smoke like avenging ghosts. a dozen Shermans falling upon the vulnerable flank of the Panzer force. In his command tank, which was itself beginning to shudder and slow as its tracks protested the deep sand, Major Croft watched in stunned disbelief. He saw the tide of the battle turn in a single, shocking moment. He saw the German tanks, caught completely by surprise, begin to panic, their turrets turning frantically to meet the new threat. He saw American cannons spitting fire, their shells finding purchase on the Panzer's weaker rear plates. "All mobile units!" he yelled into the main command channel, his voice strained with a mixture of desperation and awe. "Press the advantage! Support that flanking group! Who the hell is leading that charge?" There was a brief pause, filled only by the crackle of static and the distant sound of battle. Then his radio operator, his face pale, turned from his set. "It's Sergeant Corrigan's company, sir," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The ones with the guards." Major Croft stared out of his visions or slid at the impossible, successful charge, and for the first time, the unbending certainty in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of profound, world-altering doubt. An hour later, the sun was setting, casting the battlefield in a blood-red light. The German attack was broken. The surviving panzers, battered and smoking, were in full retreat, leaving behind the burning, blackened hulks of their comrades. The desert was littered with the wreckage of tanks from both sides, a grim testament to the battle's ferocity. The cost had been terrifyingly high, but it was sickeningly clear what would have happened without Tommy's intervention. The field was starkly divided. In the valley lay the remains of the unmodified Shermans, many of them destroyed where they sat, immobilized by the sand. Further on, scattered along the path of the flanking maneuver, were the wrecks of the modified tanks, destroyed in motion, fighting to the last. Medics moved like ghosts among the wreckage, their work illuminated by the flickering flames of dying machines. The elation of survival was a hollow thing, tempered by the heavy price of the victory. Tommy climbed out of the desert rose, his body aching, his ears ringing with the phantom sounds of cannon fire. He looked out over the carnage, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. Not far away he saw a disabled American tank, its track snapped and lying beside it in the sand, like the broken spine of some great metal beast. He felt no joy, no triumphant surge of, "I told you so." There was only a profound, soul-deep weariness and the bitter, quiet sense of vindication. He had been right. The knowledge brought him no comfort, only a deep and abiding sorrow for the men who had paid for the brass's ignorance with their lives. The following morning, a mood of exhaustion and quiet industry hung over the motor pool. The survivors worked to repair battle damage, to salvage what they could from the wrecks, and to prepare for the next, inevitable engagement. Major Croft walked slowly through the camp, his face a mask of grim contemplation. He ignored the salutes of the mechanics, his eyes distant. He stopped in front of Tommy, who was already hard at work, his hands deep in the engine compartment of one of the surviving tanks from Pops's company. The Major's gaze fell upon the simple welded guards on the tank's suspension. They were dented now, scorched by fire, and peppered with shrapnel, but they had held, they had worked. He reached out and touched one, his fingers tracing the curve of the steel as if trying to understand its secret. Then he looked directly at Tommy. "Sergeant Laird," he said. His voice was low, but it carried with an unmistakable authority that made every mechanic within earshot stop what they were doing. Tommy slowly straightened up, wiping grease from his hands on an already filthy rag. He met the Major's gaze, his heart pounding, expecting the worst, the deferred court-martial, the final, angry condemnation. Major Croft held his gaze for a long moment. "Yesterday morning," he said, his voice clear and steady, "I was preparing the paperwork for your court-martial. I was going to make an example of you." He paused, and his eyes swept over the battered tank, over the ugly life-saving guards. "Instead, it seems I am here to offer my gratitude. Your sand scrapers, as the men call them, they worked. You saved this battalion from annihilation. I was wrong." He turned as a stunned and pale Lieutenant Davies, drawn by the confrontation, scurried up to them. The Major fixed Davies with a cold, unblinking stare. "Lieutenant, I want a full report on my desk by noon detailing Sergeant Laird's design. Then, I want you to ensure that every single tank in this battalion is equipped with these guards by the end of the week. You will get this man whatever he needs, materials, manpower, anything." "That is a direct order." The The major turned and walked away without another word, his back ramrod straight. Tommy watched him go, a wave of exhaustion and disbelief washing over him. He looked at Lieutenant Davies, who could only nod in stunned, silent compliance, his face a comical picture of confusion and fear. The quiet hero, the rogue mechanic, had won. His war against the bureaucracy was over. After a moment, Tommy turned back to the tank. He picked up his welding torch, the tool of his defiance and now his vindication. Its familiar weight a comfort in his hand. There was no medal, no parade, only more work to be done. And as the bright, fierce hiss of the torch filled the air, Tommy Laird got back to it, ready to save the battalion all over again, one weld at a time.